Beatrice Fairfax stood before the mirror in her late brother's chambers, her hands trembling as she wound the linen strips around her chest, pulling them tight enough to flatten the curves that marked her as woman, as other, as forbidden in the world she was about to enter. The binding hurt, pressing against her ribs with each breath. But the discomfort steadied her somehow, reminding her that pain was temporary while ruin was forever, and her family stood 3 months from losing everything unless she could convince Sebastian Wentworth, the Duke of Ashford, to show mercy on debts her gambling-addicted father had accumulated before his death 6 months prior. Edmund's evening clothes hung loose on her smaller frame, and she'd had to stuff the shoulders with cotton batting to create the illusion of masculine breadth, had practiced lowering her voice for weeks until the register no longer cracked with feminine pitch, had studied the way men moved through the world with their legs apart and their gestures expansive, taking up space as though it belonged to them by divine right. Her auburn hair, her one vanity, lay coiled and pinned flat against her skull, beneath the cap she pulled low over her eyes, and she barely recognized the young gentleman who stared back at her from the glass, jaw set with determination, even as her hands shook with the enormity of what she was about to attempt. The Atherton Club stood as one of London's most exclusive bastions of masculine privilege, a place where women existed only as topics of conversation or objects of pursuit, never as persons in their own right. And discovery meant not merely scandal, but complete social annihilation for herself and her younger sister Charlotte, who depended on Beatrice's eventual marriage to secure her own future. But marriage required a dowry, and their dowry had been gambled away on cards and horses and foolish investments, leaving nothing but debts that compounded with interest each month, debts held by a duke who had responded to her 3 written requests for audience with silence so complete it was its own form of contempt. So she would go to him, would breach the walls of his fortress, would force him to see her, even if she had to disguise herself as one of his own kind to do it. The walk from her modest townhouse to the club took 20 minutes through gaslit London streets, and every step felt like a performance, shoulders back, stride confident, head high, nodding curtly at other gentlemen who passed, affecting the bored arrogance that seemed to be the natural expression of men who had never questioned their right to occupy space. The doorman at the Atherton Club barely glanced at her, and she realized with a start that the disguise worked because no one expected deception, because the idea of a woman infiltrating this space was so unthinkable that even a mediocre performance would succeed where perfection might draw suspicion. Inside, the club revealed itself as everything she had imagined and worse, all dark paneling and leather chairs, thick with cigar smoke that hung in the air like masculine entitlement made visible, the rumble of male laughter and political discussion creating a constant background drone that spoke of power exercised without question. Gas lamps cast amber light over green felt billiards tables, where fortunes changed hands on games treated as casual entertainment, where men stood with crystal decanters of port and brandy, where the air itself seemed heavy with the assumption that this was how the world was meant to be, that this separation of spheres was natural rather than constructed. She found Sebastian Wentworth in the largest billiards room, surrounded by a half-dozen admirers watching him play. And even from across the room she could see why society called him the most eligible bachelor in England, tall and dark-haired, with the kind of aristocratic features that looked carved rather than born, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. He was explaining a shot to a younger gentleman, his voice carrying that particular tone of amused superiority that made Beatrice's jaw clench, and when she approached and cleared her throat, lowering her voice to its practiced register, he did not even look up from the table, merely waved one hand in dismissal as though she were a servant, rather than a supplicant. "Your Grace," she said, "I come on behalf of the Fairfax family regarding debts of £10,000 owed to your estate." His cue struck the ball with a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly quiet room, and only then did he straighten, still not looking at her directly, his expression one of aristocratic boredom that suggested her very existence was an inconvenience he should not have to endure. "Tell the Fairfax daughter to sell her jewelry," he said, examining the tip of his cue with more attention than he had given her words. "I have no time for sob stories from families who cannot manage their affairs with basic competence." The casual cruelty of it, the dismissal without even the courtesy of eye contact, sent heat flooding through her chest, fury mixing with desperation in a combination that burned away caution. "Then perhaps you will make time for sport," she said, and this time her voice came out steadier, clearer, pitched to carry across the room. "One game, Your Grace. I win, you forgive half the debt. You win, I will find a way to double our payments within the year." That got his attention finally, his dark eyes lifting to her face, and she saw the exact moment he registered her as something other than a minor irritation, saw his gaze track over her borrowed clothes and too youthful features, saw the smirk that curved his mouth with something that might have been amusement or might have been contempt. "Bold for a whelp who looks barely old enough to shave," he said, but he was setting down his current cue and selecting another from the rack on the wall, choosing with the care of someone who took his games seriously, even when he pretended otherwise. "Very well. Prepare to bankrupt your family further, though I confess I am curious what kind of idiot trained you to think you could compete at a gentleman's game." The other men in the room were gathering closer now, drawn by the prospect of entertainment, their faces showing the same kind of anticipation spectators might bring to a public execution. And Beatrice felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure against her skin. She chose her cue carefully, testing the weight and balance, rolling it against the table to check for warping, doing all the things Edmund had taught her during those long afternoons, when she was still young enough to believe that skill and dedication mattered more than gender, when her brother had laughed and said she had a natural gift for seeing angles that most players took years to develop. Sebastian was chalking his cue with elaborate care, still wearing that smirk. And when he looked at her again, she saw nothing in his eyes but aristocratic certainty of victory, the absolute conviction of a man who had never imagined he might lose to someone he considered beneath him in every possible measure. The game was lag for break, and when her ball rolled to a stop 3 inches closer to the bottom rail than his, she saw surprise flicker across his face before that mask of bored amusement reasserted itself. "Perhaps you have had some training after all," he conceded, "but training and talent are different matters entirely, and I have never lost to an opponent of your apparent youth and inexperience." She did not respond, could not trust her voice not to shake with the combination of fear and rage and desperate hope that surged through her as she bent over the table for her opening break, feeling the weight of all those male eyes on her back, knowing that discovery meant ruin, but knowing also that her family's survival depended on winning this game against a man who had dismissed them with less thought than he gave to choosing his evening port. The balls scattered with a crack like thunder, and 2 solids dropped into pockets, and she straightened to find Sebastian Wentworth looking at her with something new in his expression, something that might have been the first stirring of actual attention, as though she had just transformed from furniture into person in his aristocratic perception. The game had begun, and with it the unraveling of both their careful worlds, though neither of them knew it yet. Sebastian took his first shot with the casual confidence of a man who had never seriously doubted his superiority in anything, his posture loose and relaxed as he sank 2 balls in quick succession. But Beatrice saw the slight widening of his eyes when she responded with a combination shot that sent 3 balls exactly where she intended, the angles calculated with the geometric precision Edmund had drilled into her. During those long afternoons when the rest of the world seemed determined to teach her that feminine accomplishment meant watercolors and piano rather than mathematics and strategy. The room had been filled with the low rumble of masculine conversation and the clink of crystal, but as the game progressed, something shifted in the atmosphere, a gradual quieting that spread like ripples in a pond until the only sounds were the crack of cue against ball, the whisper of felt, the soft thud of balls dropping into pockets with the inevitability of carefully planned consequences. Sebastian's posture changed first, straightening from that aristocratic slouch into something more focused, his movements becoming precise rather than casual as he began to realize that his opponent was not some reckless youth making lucky shots, but rather someone who understood the geometry of the table with an almost mathematical clarity, someone who could see 3 shots ahead and plan accordingly. "Where did a gentleman's son learn to play like this?" he asked, and there was something new in his voice now, not quite respect, but perhaps the beginning of actual attention, the recognition that he might have underestimated what he was facing, from someone who believed skill matters more than title. She replied, not looking up from the table as she lined up her next shot, a difficult bank off 2 cushions that would have been safer to avoid, but that would leave her perfectly positioned for the following play if she could execute it properly. Her hands were steady now in a way they had not been when she was binding her chest or walking through London streets, because this was the one arena where she had always felt truly capable, where gender disappeared into pure geometry and physics, where Edmund's voice still echoed in her memory, saying that the best players were those who could imagine possibilities no one else could see. The shot went exactly where she intended, and she heard Sebastian exhale, a sound that might have been frustration or admiration or something more complicated. And when she glanced at his face, she saw that his eyes had narrowed, that he was studying her more carefully now, his gaze tracking over her hands that were perhaps too delicate for a young man's, her movements that were perhaps too graceful to be entirely masculine, despite her efforts to mimic the angular gestures she had observed. The game became something electric then, each shot answered with increasing difficulty, Sebastian's bored amusement transforming into genuine focus, and then into something else entirely, something that looked almost like fascination, as he watched her calculate angles and execute strategies that most players would never attempt. The club members who had gathered to watch fell completely silent, and Beatrice was aware of them only as a pressure at the edges of her vision, all her attention concentrated on the green felt and the remaining balls, and the man across the table, whose expression had shifted from contempt to calculation to something she could not quite read. She was ahead by 3 points with 4 balls remaining when she attempted the most difficult shot of the game, a massey that required striking the cue ball with such extreme English that it curved around Sebastian's blocking ball to sink her target in the corner pocket, and she felt Edmund's presence as she made it, felt his hand over hers the way it had been when he first taught her this shot, heard his laugh when it dropped cleanly and left her perfectly positioned for her final ball. Sebastian missed his next shot, and she saw his hand tremble slightly as he stepped back from the table, saw the muscle jumping in his jaw that suggested he was processing something more than just losing a game, and when she sank her final ball, the room erupted in a chaos of voices that she barely registered through the roaring in her ears. She had won, had actually won, and for one perfect moment she forgot everything except the triumph of it, the proof that skill did matter more than circumstance, that she was as capable as she had always believed herself to be, despite what the world insisted. She straightened from the table and reached up to wipe the sweat from her brow, and that was when disaster struck, when her cap caught on her sleeve and pulled free, when her carefully pinned auburn hair tumbled down past her shoulders in a cascade that could not be mistaken for anything but female. The silence that followed was absolute, a shocked pause like the breath before thunder, and then the room exploded into shouting, chairs scraping back, men surging forward with expressions ranging from outrage to predatory excitement. "A woman!" Lord Whitmore bellowed, his face flushed with port and fury. "A woman in the Atherton Club! This is unconscionable! We must seize her and call the authorities immediately! This is a violation of every decent principle!" Beatrice's triumph drained away into terror so complete she could not move, could not think, could only stand frozen as the men advanced on her like a pack of wolves who had scented blood. And she knew with absolute certainty that her life as she had known it was over. That scandal would destroy not just her, but Charlotte as well, that her desperate gamble had failed in the worst possible way. But then Sebastian moved, stepping between her and the advancing club members with a speed that suggested military training, his body a barrier between her and the mob, and when he spoke his voice carried the kind of command that came from generations of aristocratic authority. The absolute expectation of obedience that dukes wielded like a weapon. "Touch her, Whitmore, and you will answer to me," he said. And something in his tone made the men pause, made them remember that Sebastian Wentworth was not merely their equal, but their superior in the intricate hierarchy of English aristocracy. The pause gave him the opening he needed, and he turned to face Beatrice, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been calculation, or might have been something else entirely, something that looked almost like the recognition of a kindred spirit, as though he had seen in her something he had been searching for without knowing it. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice pitched to carry across the room, "you have just witnessed me lose to my future Duchess. Miss Fairfax, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she could not process them, could not reconcile the aristocratic stranger who had dismissed her request with casual cruelty with the man who was now proposing marriage in front of London's most exclusive gathering of masculine power. "You cannot be serious," she managed to say, her voice coming out breathless and higher than she intended, all her careful masculine performance shattered along with her disguise. "I have never been more serious," he replied, and there was something in his expression that suggested he meant it, though whether from honor or amusement or some more complicated motivation, she could not begin to guess. "Say yes, or face scandal. I am offering you a choice." It was not really a choice, they both knew that, because the alternative was ruin so complete that even death might be preferable. But there was something in the way he framed it, in the way he stood between her and the hostile crowd, that suggested he understood exactly what he was taking from her even as he offered rescue. The gas lamps seemed to brighten, spotlighting them in a tableau that would be gossiped about in drawing rooms across London within hours. The Duke and the woman who had dared to infiltrate masculine sanctuary, who had beaten him at his own game in forbidden territory. And Beatrice felt the weight of all those watching eyes, all those shocked faces, some scandalized and others almost intrigued, as though they were witnessing something unprecedented, and could not quite decide whether it was disaster or entertainment. She looked at Sebastian's extended hand, at the face that showed nothing but aristocratic certainty, despite what must be roiling beneath that careful surface. And she thought about Charlotte waiting at home, about the estate that would be lost within months, about the fact that she had gambled everything and lost it all, despite winning the game. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word torn from her throat by necessity rather than desire. "Yes, I will marry you." The room erupted again, but this time the chaos felt different, as though the narrative had shifted from scandal to spectacle, from crime to romance, the kind of story that society would reshape into acceptable form through sheer force of collective will. Sebastian's hand closed around hers, warm and steady, and she felt the trembling in her own fingers, the terror and confusion and desperate relief mixing together until she could not separate one emotion from another. He drew her closer, not quite an embrace, but close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that spoke of a world so far removed from her own that they might as well be different species. And when he spoke again, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "I will explain everything," he said, "but for now, trust that I am offering you safety, even if I cannot offer you choice." She wanted to argue, wanted to demand explanations immediately, wanted to rage against the fact that she had freed herself from one trap only to fall into another. But the crowd was pressing closer now, voices raised in congratulation and speculation, and Sebastian was guiding her toward the door with one hand at the small of her back, creating a path through the chaos, through sheer force of aristocratic will. The last thing she saw as they exited the billiards room was the green felt table where she had won and lost everything in the space of a single game, where her brother's lessons had proven both triumph and disaster, where her life had irrevocably changed in ways she could not yet begin to comprehend. And she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The carriage ride to Sebastian's townhouse passed in a blur of gaslit streets and her own ragged breathing, and Beatrice sat as far from him as the confined space allowed, her borrowed coat pulled tight around her shoulders even though the night was not particularly cold, the trembling in her hands having nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the complete dissolution of the life she had known just hours before. Sebastian said nothing during the journey, merely watched her with that unreadable expression that might have been concern or calculation or aristocratic assessment of damaged goods, and she hated him for his silence almost as much as she hated herself for the desperate gratitude that warred with her fury, because he had saved her even as he had trapped her, had offered rescue that felt indistinguishable from capture. His townhouse rose before them like a monument to everything she would never be, all white stone and perfect proportions, the kind of address that appeared in marriage announcements and society columns, that spoke of wealth so old it had calcified into assumption rather than achievement. And when he handed her down from the carriage, his touch was impersonal, careful, as though she were a piece of valuable but fragile cargo that might shatter if mishandled. Inside, the entrance hall stretched upward into shadows punctuated by more gaslights than her family home possessed in its entirety, and servants materialized with the silent efficiency of those trained to anticipate aristocratic needs before they were spoken, taking her brother's coat and cap without comment, though their eyes betrayed their shock at her masculine attire. Sebastian spoke quietly to his housekeeper, an older woman whose face showed nothing but professional courtesy, despite what must have been tremendous curiosity. And within minutes, Beatrice found herself in a guest chamber, being helped into proper feminine clothing, borrowed from Sebastian's younger sister, who was conveniently visiting friends in Bath, and would not miss a single gown from her extensive wardrobe. The dress was beautiful, all ivory silk and delicate lace, but it hung loose on Beatrice's smaller frame and made her feel like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes, a little girl pretending to belong in a world that would always see her as interloper rather than equal. When she finally made her way to Sebastian's study, escorted by a maid who knocked and then disappeared with the discretion of well-trained servants, she found him standing before the fire with a glass of brandy in his hand, still wearing his evening clothes from the club, and the sight of him in his natural habitat, surrounded by leather-bound books and hunting trophies, and all the accumulated symbols of masculine power and privilege, made her fury rise up hot and choking in her throat. "This is a joke to you, is it not?" she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it, refusing to move further into the room, refusing to sit in the chair he gestured toward, refusing to accept the brandy he offered. "A lark, the Duke who captured the billiards-playing intruder. What a story you will have to tell at your next dinner party." His expression did not change, but something flickered in his dark eyes, something that might have been irritation or might have been respect for her refusal to be pacified. "If I wanted a joke, Miss Fairfax, I would have let Whitmore call the magistrate," he said, his voice level and cool. "You would be in Newgate by morning, charged with trespassing and fraud, and your family's name would be destroyed so thoroughly that your sister would never make a respectable marriage. So I should thank you for this prison instead," she replied bitterly, beginning to pace because standing still felt impossible, because the energy coursing through her needed outlet or it would tear her apart from the inside. "You have traded one form of captivity for another, debt for marriage, financial obligation for legal binding, and I am supposed to be grateful that you have saved me from consequences of my own desperate actions." He watched her pace with that same unreadable expression, lounging in his chair with deceptive casualness that she recognized now as a performance, a careful construction of aristocratic ease that hid whatever he was actually thinking. "I am offering you freedom from debt and my name," he said. "What you make of it is your choice." But it was not really a choice. They both knew that, because scandal would follow her regardless now. The woman who had infiltrated the Atherton Club in masculine disguise, who had beaten the Duke at billiards and somehow emerged engaged rather than ruined, and society would watch their marriage, with the avid attention usually reserved for public executions or royal weddings. "Then I choose a marriage in name only," she said, stopping her pacing to face him directly, lifting her chin despite the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes, angry tears that she would not let fall in front of him. 1 year, then a quiet separation. You get your entertainment, whatever amusement you derive from having captured the unusual Miss Fairfax, and I get my family's survival. We will fulfill the bare minimum of public expectation and then part ways with our respective dignities intact. Something flickered in his eyes then, something that looked almost like pain or perhaps disappointment, though why he should be disappointed by her completely reasonable proposal she could not begin to understand. "Agreed," he said, and the ease of his acceptance made her irrationally angry, as though some part of her had wanted him to argue, to insist on a real marriage, to suggest that their arrangement might be something more than mutual convenience. "On one condition," he continued, setting down his brandy glass and rising from his chair with fluid grace. "You must teach me how you really play. No more pretending to lose to preserve male pride. No more holding back to make your opponent feel superior. I want to learn to see the table the way you do." She stared at him, caught completely off guard by this request that made no sense in the context of their forced engagement. "Why would you want that?" she asked, suspicious that this was some kind of trick, some way of mocking her further by pretending interest in the skill that had brought about her downfall. "Because I have been losing at far more important games than billiards," he said, and there was something in his voice now that suggested he was being honest, or at least more honest than he had been until this moment. "And I suspect you know strategies I have never considered, ways of seeing possibilities that my expensive education and aristocratic training somehow failed to teach me." The admission surprised her, this crack in his aristocratic armor, this suggestion that perhaps he was not as entirely confident and self-satisfied as he appeared, and she found herself studying his face more carefully, looking for signs of deception or mockery, but finding instead something that looked almost like genuine interest. "Very well," she said slowly. "I will teach you to play, and you will release my family from our debts. We will maintain the appearance of engagement and marriage for 1 year, and then we will separate quietly, citing incompatibility or whatever excuse society finds most palatable." He nodded and moved to his desk, pulling out a heavy ledger and several official-looking documents that she recognized even from a distance as the debt papers her father had signed, the contracts that had hung over her family like a sword suspended by increasingly frayed thread. He carried them to the fireplace and held them over, the flames looking at her as he did so, and she saw the fire reflected in his dark eyes as the papers caught and began to curl into ash, as her father's signature and the impossible sums and all the weight of financial obligation transformed into smoke and memory. She should have felt relief, should have felt triumph at seeing those chains destroyed, but instead she felt only a strange hollowing out, as though she had traded one form of captivity for another, and could not yet calculate whether she had won or lost in the exchange. The borrowed dress hung loose on her frame, making her acutely aware of how ill-fitted she was for this world of silk and servants and casual wealth, and when Sebastian approached her with his handkerchief, clearly intending to offer it for the tears that were now streaming down her face despite her best efforts at control. She flinched away from him, unable to bear his kindness or his pity or whatever motivation lay behind his careful courtesy. His expression flickered then, something that might have been guilt or curiosity or calculation, and he stopped his approach, respecting her withdrawal even as his hand remained extended with the offered linen. Outside the study windows, rain had begun to fall, pattering against glass with the kind of steady rhythm that suggested it would continue through the night, washing away the last traces of who she had been before tonight, before the billiards game and the exposure and the proposal that had saved and trapped her in equal measure. The study felt both intimate and vast, the leather and mahogany closing in even as the bookshelves stretched upward into shadow, and she was acutely aware of being alone with him in a way that would have been completely inappropriate just hours ago, but was now somehow sanctioned by their engagement, by the fact that society would expect them to spend time together, to learn each other's habits and preferences, to perform the rituals of courtship, even though they both knew it was a fiction constructed to make scandal into romance. "You should rest," Sebastian said finally, his voice gentle in a way that made her want to rage at him, or weep, or both. "My housekeeper has prepared a chamber for you, and in the morning we will send word to your family and arrange for your belongings to be brought here. The engagement will be announced in the Times by afternoon, and by evening all of London will be discussing how the Duke of Ashford was so captivated by a woman's skill at billiards that he proposed on the spot. They will make it romantic, turn our mutual trap into a love story, and we will smile and accept their congratulations and play our parts until the curtain can finally close." She nodded, too exhausted suddenly to argue, too drained by the emotional violence of the past hours to do anything but accept his direction. And when he opened the study door and summoned a maid to escort her to her chamber, she went without protest, looking back only once to see him standing before the fire, the burned debt papers now nothing but ash in the grate, his expression unreadable as he watched her leave. The guest chamber was beautiful, all cream and gold with a canopied bed that could have slept 4 people comfortably, and she dismissed the maid and stood at the window watching rain streak the glass, trying to make sense of how her desperate gambit to save her family had transformed into this strange new captivity. She had won the game, had beaten Sebastian at billiards in front of witnesses who could never deny her skill, had proven that she was as capable as any man when given the same opportunities, but victory had brought not freedom but a different kind of binding, a marriage that would last 1 year and then release them both to whatever separate futures they could construct from the rubble of this night. Dawn was creeping through the curtains when she finally climbed into the enormous bed, still wearing the borrowed silk gown because she had nothing else. And as she drifted toward exhausted sleep, she wondered whether Sebastian was also awake in some other part of this massive house, whether he was regretting his impulsive proposal or calculating how to make the best of an inconvenient situation, whether he felt as trapped as she did, or whether this was all simply another game to him, one more strategy in the complicated chess match of aristocratic life that she was only beginning to understand. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. They retreated to Ashford Park 3 days after the engagement announcement, fleeing London's avid curiosity for the relative sanctuary of Sebastian's country estate, and Beatrice spent the first week exploring the grounds and avoiding her future husband, except at meals where they maintained the kind of polite, distant conversation that strangers might exchange at a dinner party, discussing weather and landscape, and nothing of any substance whatsoever. The billiards room occupied the east wing of the manor house, smaller and more intimate than the cavernous space at the Atherton Club, with tall windows overlooking gardens where autumn was beginning to assert itself in bursts of gold and crimson. And when she arrived for their first lesson, she found Sebastian already there, standing with military posture beside the table, his expression carefully neutral. She had prepared a speech about rules and expectations, about maintaining professional distance during instruction, but the words died in her throat when she saw how he held himself, all rigid formality and aristocratic control, and she realized with sudden clarity that he was as uncomfortable with this arrangement as she was, that his apparent ease was as much performance as her own careful courtesy. They maintained 3 feet of distance during that first lesson, Beatrice's instructions coldly technical as she explained angles and English and how to calculate the path of the cue ball after impact, and Sebastian listened with the focused attention of someone taking military orders, executing each shot with precision, but without any real understanding of why certain strategies worked better than others. "You are playing like you are following a recipe," she told him after he missed an easy combination shot for the 3rd time. Billiards is not about memorizing positions. It is about understanding principles and then seeing how they apply to each unique situation. He had frowned at that, clearly frustrated by his own limitations, and she had felt an unwelcome flicker of sympathy for this man who was accustomed to excellence in everything he attempted, who was discovering that natural talent and expensive instruction could only carry someone so far. The second lesson went much the same way, formal and distant, her demonstrating shots while he watched and then attempted to replicate them with varying degrees of success. And she told herself that this was exactly what she wanted, a purely transactional arrangement where she fulfilled her obligation to teach him and he fulfilled his obligation to shelter her from scandal. And in 1 year they would part as cordial acquaintances who had never really known each other at all. But during the 3rd lesson, something shifted, some indefinable change in the atmosphere that Beatrice could not quite identify until Sebastian made an impossible bank shot she had taught him, the kind that required visualizing angles that seemed counterintuitive, and he laughed with genuine delight at his success, the sound so unexpected and unguarded that she found herself smiling in response before she could stop herself. "That was perfect," she said, and meant it, because the shot had been genuinely impressive, showing that he was beginning to internalize the principles rather than just memorizing positions. "You are starting to see the table differently now, starting to understand that what looks impossible is often just unexpected." His face transformed when he laughed, she noticed, all that aristocratic distance dissolving into something warmer and more human, and she felt her own careful walls beginning to crack despite her best efforts to maintain them. Over the following weeks, the lessons became less formal, the 3-foot distance shrinking to 2 feet, and then to whatever proximity was necessary for proper instruction, and Beatrice found herself forgetting to be guarded when she was explaining strategy, her enthusiasm for the game overriding her determination to remain aloof and professional. "You are playing like you are afraid to fail," she told him during their 5th lesson, when he chose a safe shot, over a risky one that would have been far more effective. "This shot requires confidence, requires believing that you can make it even when logic suggests otherwise." "Confidence," he said, and there was something sharp in his voice, from the woman who had to disguise herself as a man to be heard. The words stung, and she felt heat flooding her face, felt the familiar anger rising at this reminder of her humiliation. "I disguised myself because your world refuses to see women as anything but ornaments," she replied, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Because I knew that walking into that club as myself would have resulted in immediate dismissal, that my skill and my family's need would matter less than the fact that I lacked the proper anatomy to be taken seriously." He was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally looked at his face, she saw something there that might have been shame or recognition, or both. "You are right," he said quietly. "I apologize. That was unfair." Another pause, longer this time, and then, "Teach me to play like you, like someone with nothing left to lose." The request surprised her, the honesty of it, and she found herself studying him more carefully, seeing past the aristocratic armor to something more vulnerable underneath. "Very well," she said, and began teaching him not just technique, but philosophy, explaining how Edmund had always said that the best players were the ones who could imagine possibilities no one else sees, who could look at a table full of obstacles and see opportunities instead. Sebastian proved to be a quick study once he stopped trying to follow the rigid rules of gentlemanly play, once he allowed himself to take risks and attempt shots that conventional wisdom said were impossible, and she felt an unwelcome pride in his progress, in the way his face would light up when he executed a particularly difficult combination, or when he finally understood why an unconventional angle worked better than the obvious approach. During the lessons, they began actually talking, not the polite nothing conversations of their formal dinners, but real exchanges about their lives and losses, and the ways they had learned to survive in a world that seemed determined to fit them into boxes they did not quite match. She learned that his parents had died in a fire when he was 19, that he had become Duke far too young with responsibilities he felt completely unprepared for, that his arrogance and rigid behavior came not from natural superiority, but from desperate fear of appearing incompetent, of failing the legacy that had been thrust upon him before he was ready. He learned that she had been managing her family's estate for years after her father descended into gambling addiction following her mother's death, that her brother Edmund had died in a riding accident just 2 years ago, that her billiards skill came from those long afternoons when Edmund would take her to their old barn to escape their father's dark moods, teaching her geometry and physics through the medium of felt and ivory balls. Edmund always said the best players are the ones who can imagine possibilities no one else sees, she said softly during their 8th lesson, when Sebastian asked why she always seemed to find solutions that never occurred to him. That the game is not about what is, but about what could be, if you are willing to risk everything on a single shot. "Is that what you do?" Sebastian asked, watching her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "See impossible possibilities." "I did once," she replied, focusing on the table rather than meeting his eyes. "Before I learned the world has very narrow ideas about what is possible for people like me. Perhaps the world needs better imagination," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up, made her meet his gaze and see something there that looked almost like respect, like genuine regard rather than aristocratic condescension. The physical proximity required for proper instruction built a tension she had not anticipated. Moments when she needed to adjust his stance or correct his grip and her hands would brush against his coat, when he would lean close to see the angle she was demonstrating, and she would catch the scent of his cologne mixed with chalk dust, when their eyes would meet across the table and hold for just a moment too long before one of them looked away. There was the lesson when she overreached across the table to demonstrate a particularly difficult shot and lost her balance, and Sebastian caught her before she could fall, his hands strong and steady on her waist, and they both froze in that position, breath catching, acutely aware of the warmth of his touch through the thin fabric of her day dress. He released her immediately, stepping back with an apology that sounded almost strangled, and she had turned away to hide the flush in her cheeks, telling herself that her racing heart was merely from the shock of nearly falling and not from anything else, certainly not from the way his hands had felt or the concern in his eyes. She began arriving early for their lessons without quite meaning to, finding excuses to be in the billiards room before the appointed time, and she would notice that Sebastian was often already there, practicing shots she had taught him, or simply standing at the window, watching the autumn colors deepen in the gardens. The servants began bringing tea service without being asked, having noticed that the Duke and his intended Duchess were spending increasing amounts of time together in the East Wing, and sometimes the lessons would extend far beyond their scheduled hour, both of them reluctant to leave this space that had become somehow theirs, a sanctuary from the expectations and performances required everywhere else. She caught him watching her sometimes, his gaze tracking her face as she calculated angles, and when she asked what he was looking at, he said, that he was fascinated by the intelligence in her eyes, by the way her whole expression changed when she was working through a complex problem, and she did not know how to respond to that, so she simply returned to her demonstration, trying to ignore the warmth that bloomed in her chest at his words. He asked about her life with genuine curiosity, not the polite, superficial questions of social obligation, but real interest in how she had managed an estate, what strategies she had used to stretch insufficient funds, what it was like to carry responsibility that society insisted she should not have to bear. And she found herself answering honestly, surprised by how good it felt to be truly heard, to have someone listen to her answers and remember details and ask follow-up questions days later. The billiards room transformed over those 6 weeks from a space of obligation into something else entirely. The afternoon light streaming through tall windows making dust motes dance in the air, the rhythmic click of balls and the soft whisper of felt becoming a kind of music, chalk dust marking their fingers and sometimes their faces when they forgot themselves enough to brush hair back without thinking. The leaves outside turned from green to gold to crimson, autumn settling over Ashford Park with the kind of beauty that felt almost melancholy, and Beatrice would sometimes pause in the middle of a lesson to watch the view, thinking about how temporary all of this was, how in less than a year she would leave this place and this man and return to her modest life. And the thought brought not relief but a hollowness she refused to examine too closely. Neither of them acknowledged what was happening, both maintaining the fiction that this was simply fulfilling the terms of their agreement, that the growing ease between them was merely the natural result of spending time together, that the way they began to anticipate each other's thoughts and finish each other's sentences was just convenience rather than connection. But servants gossiped and noticed the way the Duke smiled more during these weeks than he had in the 2 years since his parents' death, noticed how Miss Fairfax's sharp edges seemed to soften when she was teaching, how sometimes they would find the pair of them talking long after the lesson should have ended, sitting on the window seat with teacups forgotten and growing cold, speaking with the kind of intimacy that suggested they had forgotten anyone else existed. The lessons became the center around which both their days revolved, and Beatrice found herself thinking about Sebastian at odd moments, remembering something he had said or wondering what he would make of a particular strategic problem, and she told herself this was simply intellectual interest, professional investment in her student's progress, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the way her heart would lift when she walked into the billiards room and found him already there, waiting. For her, face lighting with a smile that felt meant only for her, that transformed his aristocratic features into something warm and open and achingly vulnerable. The season began with all the inevitability of a storm gathering on the horizon, and their return to London felt like leaving sanctuary for battlefield, trading the quiet intimacy of Ashford Park's billiards room for the glittering, vicious world of society that would judge their union with the kind of avid cruelty that passed for entertainment among the aristocracy. Beatrice spent the morning of the Whitmore ball constructing armor from silk and stays, her maid pulling her corset tight enough that breathing became a conscious effort, arranging her hair in elaborate coils that felt like a crown of thorns, fastening jewelry borrowed from Sebastian's family vault that weighed heavy as chains around her throat, and when she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. All perfect posture and forced composure, every inch the Duchess she was pretending to become. Sebastian waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, devastatingly handsome in his evening clothes, and something flickered in his eyes when he saw her, something that might have been admiration or might have been concern, and he offered his arm with the kind of formal courtesy they had abandoned during their weeks at the estate, both of them slipping back into performance mode as easily as donning masks. The Whitmore ballroom glittered with what must have been 1,000 candles, all that flame and crystal creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously magnificent and suffocating, the air thick with expensive perfume and the weight of judgment. And the moment they were announced, Beatrice felt the attention of the entire room fix upon them like a physical pressure, felt the whispers start immediately, a constant undertone of malice beneath the orchestral music that made her want to turn and flee back to the carriage. Sebastian's jaw clenched, but his expression remained one of ducal calm, that aristocratic mask he wore so well, and he guided her into the ballroom with one hand at the small of her back, a touch that was both possessive and protective, claiming her as his in front of everyone who had gathered to witness their first public appearance since the scandal. The whispers followed them like a wake, cutting and cruel in the way that society excelled at, speculation about whether the Duke had lost a wager or his mind, whether Miss Fairfax had actually trapped him, or whether this was some elaborate joke they were not sophisticated enough to understand. And Beatrice kept her chin high and her expression serene, even as each barbed comment landed like a physical blow. They had made it perhaps 20 minutes into the evening, accepting congratulations from those brave or curious enough to approach them directly, when Lady Henrietta Tilney materialized from the crowd like a particularly elegant viper, all golden curls and pale blue silk, and a smile that did not reach her ice-colored eyes. "How extraordinary, Miss Fairfax," Henrietta said, her voice pitched just loud enough that those nearby could hear clearly, or should I say, Duchess Ashford, though I suppose we must wait for the actual ceremony before that title is truly yours. Most women catch husbands through beauty or breeding, but billiards in disguise, quite the innovative approach. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking, delivered with such sweetness that any objection would seem like overreaction, and Beatrice felt Sebastian go rigid beside her, felt him draw breath to respond with what would probably be a cutting defense. But she spoke first, her voice cool and steady, despite the fury burning through her veins. "Lady Henrietta," she said, "I understand you are celebrated for your card play. Shall we test whether your skill matches your confidence in judgment?" The challenge hung in the air for a moment, and Beatrice saw surprise flicker across Henrietta's perfect features, saw the calculation as the other woman decided whether to accept or retreat, and then Henrietta's smile sharpened into something predatory. "Whist," she said. "My brother Charles and I against you and the Duke, unless of course you find the prospect too intimidating." Sebastian's hand tightened briefly on Beatrice's back, a question and an offer of support, and when she glanced at him, she saw not concern, but something that looked almost like pride, like he had been waiting to see whether she would fight back or submit to society's cruelty. "Lead the way," Beatrice replied, and followed Henrietta through the ballroom to where card tables had been set up for those who preferred games of skill to dancing, acutely aware of the crowd following them, of conversations stopping as people realized something entertaining was about to unfold, aristocrats circling like spectators at a duel. The card table became a battlefield, 4 chairs arranged with mathematical precision, Charles Tilney arriving to partner his sister with the same ice-colored eyes and calculating expression, and as they took their seats, Beatrice felt the weight of perhaps 50 people pressing close to watch, their breathing and whispers creating a sound like wind before a storm. Sebastian sat across from her, their eyes meeting for just a moment, and in that glance passed an entire conversation, a wordless communication built from 6 weeks of lessons and growing understanding. And she knew with absolute certainty that they could do this, that whatever else was uncertain between them, in this arena, they were perfectly matched. The first hand was cautious, both pairs testing each other's strengths and weaknesses, but by the second hand, Beatrice felt herself falling into the rhythm of strategy, reading the cards and the players with the same geometric clarity she brought to billiards, calculating probabilities and psychological tells, and she realized that Sebastian was doing the same, that they were thinking in parallel, anticipating each other's moves with uncanny accuracy. She led a low heart, and he immediately understood her strategy, playing to her lead in a way that set up a sequence 3 tricks ahead. And when they took that trick along with the following 2, she saw surprise register on Henrietta's face, the first crack in that perfect composure. The game became electric then, each card played with increasing tension, the crowd around them falling silent enough that Beatrice could hear the whisper of pasteboard against felt, could hear Sebastian's breathing synchronizing with her own, could feel the electricity between them building with each successful play. They communicated without words, a glance or a slight shift in posture, conveying volumes. Beatrice's strategic thinking complementing Sebastian's calculated risks in a way that made them more than the sum of their parts, and she felt something fierce and joyful rising in her chest, the pure pleasure of perfect partnership, of being truly seen and matched by someone who understood not just the game, but the way her mind worked. By the final hand, the outcome was inevitable. Beatrice and Sebastian ahead, by enough that even brilliant play could not save the Tilney siblings. And when Beatrice played the final card that sealed their victory, the crowd erupted into applause and speculation, voices rising with the kind of excitement that came from witnessing something unexpected and thoroughly entertaining. Henrietta's face had gone pale beneath her powder, and Charles looked thunderous, but Sebastian was smiling, genuine and unguarded in a way Beatrice had only seen during their private lessons, and before she could stop herself, she was smiling back, sharing this moment of triumph with the one person who could fully appreciate what it meant. "My Duchess does not need to trap anyone," Sebastian said then, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space, pitched for the crowd but his eyes on Henrietta. "She simply defeats them honestly, a strategy I recommend you consider, Lady Henrietta." The rebuke was devastating precisely because it was delivered without anger, simply fact stated with aristocratic certainty, and Beatrice saw Henrietta flinch as though struck, saw the way people began to whisper with new speculation, reassessing, perhaps, whether the Duke's unusual choice of bride might actually be a brilliant match rather than a scandal to be pitied. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and curious questions, society's attitude shifting with the mercurial speed that characterized their world, and when they finally escaped to their carriage in the early hours of morning, Beatrice felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the emotional performance required by social warfare. The carriage interior was intimate and dark, lit only by the passing gas lamps that sent shifting patterns of light across Sebastian's face as they swayed with the movement over cobblestones, and the silence between them felt weighted with everything they were not saying, with the electricity that had built during the card game, and had nowhere to go now that they were alone. "You were magnificent tonight," Sebastian said finally, his voice low and rough in the darkness. "The way you read that final hand, the way you anticipated Charles's play 3 tricks ahead, it was extraordinary. We made a good team," Beatrice replied, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to maintain the careful distance they had abandoned during the game, but that felt necessary now in this dangerous privacy. "We do," Sebastian said, and she could feel him moving closer even before she saw it, could feel the shift in the air between them. "In everything, not just cards or billiards, but in all of it. Beatrice, we are perfectly matched, and I think you know it as well as I do." His hand came up to cup her face, warm and gentle, and for one breathless moment she let herself lean into the touch, let herself feel the rightness of it, the way her body seemed to recognize his as something essential, and when his thumb brushed across her cheekbone, she felt her breath catch, felt her eyes begin to close as he leaned closer. But then reality crashed back, cold and inescapable, the memory of their agreement and the temporary nature of this arrangement, and she pulled back sharply, pressing herself against the opposite seat, her voice shaking when she spoke. "Sebastian, we agreed," she said, hating how her words trembled, hating the hurt that flashed across his face. 1 year, we agreed to 1 year and then separation. This is not, we cannot." "You are right," he said, withdrawing immediately, his voice rough with what might have been pain or frustration, or both. "Forgive me, I forgot myself." The cold rushed in between them, filling the space where warmth had been just moments before, and they sat rigid on opposite seats, both staring determinedly out their respective windows as gas-lit London streets passed by, the public world continuing outside their private moment of loss. Beatrice felt tears threatening and forced them back through sheer will, refusing to cry in front of him, refusing to acknowledge what she had just rejected, or why the rejection felt like tearing something vital from her own chest. The carriage ride lasted perhaps 15 more minutes, but felt like hours. Every second weighted with the things they were not saying, with the feelings they were not acknowledging. And when they finally arrived at the townhouse, they separated immediately. Sebastian murmuring something about correspondence that needed attention and disappearing into his study. Beatrice fleeing to her chambers where she finally let herself cry, angry tears that she could not quite explain, mourning something she had never really had and could never allow herself to want. She had won tonight, had defeated Henrietta and proven herself worthy in society's eyes, had shown that she and Sebastian could be perfect partners when they chose to be. But victory felt hollow because it only made clearer what she would be losing when their year ended, only emphasized how well they fit together, and how impossible it was to believe that such a perfect fit could be anything more than temporary convenience. The borrowed jewelry felt heavy around her throat as she removed it, returning it to its velvet case, and she thought about how all of this was borrowed, temporary, a performance that would end when the curtain finally fell, and she told herself that maintaining their boundaries was necessary, was self-protection, was the only way to survive the inevitable separation without being destroyed by it. But as she climbed into bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, she could still feel the ghost of his hand on her face, could still see the hurt in his eyes when she pulled away, and she wondered whether protecting herself from future pain was worth the present ache that seemed to be hollowing her out from the inside, leaving her empty in a way that felt worse than any scandal or ruin could have been. 3 days before their 1-year anniversary, which was also 3 days before their agreed separation would transform from theoretical future into present reality, Beatrice found herself in Sebastian's study looking for a book he had mentioned during dinner the previous evening, some treatise on agricultural innovation that she thought might help with managing her family's small estate once she returned to it. And she was searching the shelves near his desk when she knocked over a stack of papers that scattered across the leather surface like evidence at a trial. She bent to gather them automatically, not intending to read private correspondence, but her own family name caught her eye on one document, and then she saw her father's signature, and confusion turned to ice-cold horror as she began to understand what she was looking at. The papers told a story in legal language and financial figures, a story about a business venture between their fathers 15 years ago, about money Sebastian's father had borrowed from hers and never repaid before both men died, about debts that ran in both directions, obligations that should have cancelled each other out through mutual settlement. Her hands shook as she read through document after document, seeing with terrible clarity that Sebastian had always known, that he could have declared the debts void through offsetting claims, that he had chosen instead to hold her family's obligation over them like a sword while conveniently forgetting his own family's counter-debt. He had orchestrated the entire situation, had known that eventually the pressure would force some kind of confrontation, had been waiting for her to come to him, desperate and pleading, and every moment of the past year suddenly felt tainted, contaminated by this fundamental deception that poisoned everything they had built together. She was still standing there, papers clutched in trembling hands, when Sebastian entered his study and stopped dead in the doorway, his face going white as he saw what she held, saw the expression on her face that must have communicated her understanding and her fury. "You knew," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the way her entire body was shaking. "Before the club, before everything, you knew you could cancel these debts." "Yes," he replied, and at least he did not insult her intelligence by trying to deny it, but his admission felt like another betrayal, confirmation that everything she had begun to believe about him had been built on lies. "This whole year," she continued, hearing her voice go cold and distant. "The proposal, the lessons, all of it was manipulation. I was a fool to think any of it was real." "You were never a fool," he said, taking a step into the room, his aristocratic control cracking to show something desperate underneath. I was the fool, Beatrice, please let me explain." She laughed then, a bitter sound that hurt her throat. "Explain what? That you held my family hostage for your own amusement, that you manipulated a desperate woman into a false marriage because it entertained you, that everything I thought was growing between us was just another strategy in whatever game you have been playing. I saw you 2 years ago," he said, the words tumbling out now as though he could not contain them. "At the Dashwood estate, you were in the garden reading Descartes, and you laughed at something on the page, and I could not stop thinking about you, about what kind of woman reads philosophy in a garden and finds it amusing rather than tedious." "Do not," she said, fury rising hot enough to burn away the ice. "Do not romanticize your cruelty. Do not pretend this was some grand passion when it was just manipulation and control." "It was not romance," he agreed, and his voice was breaking now, aristocratic composure shattering completely. "It was cowardice. I was too proud to approach you properly, too arrogant to imagine a woman of your standing would consider me, a duke who could have anyone but was terrified of being rejected by the one person who actually mattered. When I learned of the debts, I convinced myself I was helping, creating an opportunity for us to meet." "Helping?" she repeated incredulously. "You held my family hostage. You forced me into a position where I had to debase myself, had to disguise myself and infiltrate a place I was forbidden, had to risk everything just to get your attention, and you call that helping?" "I fell in love with you during our 3rd lesson," he said desperately, moving closer despite the way she stepped back. "When you explained the geometry of impossible angles, your whole face lit up, and I knew I would never want anyone else. But you had made it so clear our arrangement was temporary, and I was terrified that if I confessed, you would think it was obligation or pity rather than genuine feeling." "So you said nothing," she said, and tears were streaming down her face now, though her voice remained steady. "You let me believe we were playing a game, with clear rules while you rewrote them in secret. Let me start to trust you, start to care, all while knowing you had built everything on deception from the very beginning." "Yes?" he said, and now his voice was breaking completely. "I am sorry. I am so desperately sorry. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but please, Beatrice, please let me try to make this right." "I do not know if I can forgive this," she said, backing toward the door. "I do not know if I can trust anything between us was real, if any moment we shared was genuine, or if it was all just part of your elaborate manipulation." She turned and fled before he could respond, taking the stairs to her chambers 2 at a time, and began packing with methodical determination, each folded garment a decision, each closed trunk a statement that she would not stay in this house built on lies for one more night than absolutely necessary. Thunder rumbled in the distance, as though the sky itself was responding to the emotional tempest, and through her window she could see storm clouds gathering, turning afternoon into premature twilight. Sebastian appeared in her doorway as she was fastening the final trunk, his face showing more raw emotion than she had ever seen there. All his aristocratic masks stripped away to reveal something wounded and desperate. "Please do not leave like this," he said. "Stay, let us talk. Let me find some way to prove to you that what I feel is real, even if how we began was wrong." But she could not stay, could not remain in this room that had felt like sanctuary, but now felt like a beautiful prison. Could not look at him without seeing the evidence of his deception scattered across his desk downstairs. "The carriage is waiting," she said, her voice flat and distant. "Our agreement was for 1 year. 3 more days changes nothing except to prolong the inevitable." When she moved to pass him in the doorway, he caught her arm, gently but firmly enough to stop her, and she saw tears in his eyes, which shocked her because she had never imagined Sebastian Wentworth capable of crying. "I love you," he said, the words torn from him like a confession. "I know I have no right to say it. No, I have forfeited any claim to your regard through my own cowardice and manipulation. But it is true, and has been true for longer than I can bear to admit." She pulled her arm free, could not allow herself to soften, could not let his words penetrate the armor she was constructing to survive this. "Love built on deception is not love at all," she said. "It is just another form of control." She walked past him then and did not look back, even when she heard what might have been a sob from behind her, made her way down the stairs and out to where the carriage waited in the gathering storm. Rain had begun to fall, cold and steady, and the servants loading her trunks moved with sad efficiency, their faces carefully neutral, though she knew they must have heard at least part of the confrontation. As the carriage pulled away, she looked back once and saw Sebastian standing in the doorway, rain soaking through his shirt because he had not bothered with a coat, his face a study in devastation. But she forced herself to turn away, to stare resolutely forward at the road that led away from London and back to the small estate where she would rebuild whatever life was possible after this year of beautiful deception. The tears came then, rage and heartbreak mixed together until she could not distinguish one from the other, crying for the man she thought she had been falling in love with, for the partnership she had begun to believe was real, for the future she had allowed herself to imagine, despite knowing better, despite all her careful walls and determined self-protection. The storm matched her mood, rain hammering against the carriage roof, thunder rolling like artillery, lightning illuminating the countryside in stark flashes that made everything look strange and foreign. She thought about the billiards room at Ashford Park, about afternoon light making dust motes dance while they played and talked and slowly learned each other's stories. And that sanctuary now felt tainted, contaminated by the knowledge that he had been manipulating her from before they even met. That his interest had never been spontaneous or genuine, but rather calculated and controlled. She thought about the card game at the Whitmore ball, about the perfect synchronization between them, the wordless communication and absolute trust, and wondered how she could have trusted him so completely when he had never truly trusted her enough to be honest. The worst part was not even the deception itself, but what it revealed about his fundamental character. That when faced with something he wanted, his instinct was to manipulate and control rather than to risk genuine vulnerability, to orchestrate circumstances rather than to approach honestly and accept possible rejection. She had spent the past year slowly lowering her walls, slowly allowing herself to believe that perhaps this temporary arrangement might transform into something real, slowly learning to trust again after her father's betrayals and her brother's death. And now she felt foolish for having believed any of it, for having imagined that an aristocratic duke could genuinely care for a woman of modest means and scandalous reputation beyond whatever amusement or convenience she provided. The journey to her family's estate took 6 hours through worsening weather, and by the time she arrived she was exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical tiredness, drained by emotional violence and the effort of holding herself together when what she really wanted was to shatter into pieces. Charlotte met her at the door, clearly shocked by her early and unannounced arrival, and took one look at Beatrice's face before pulling her into an embrace that finally broke through her carefully maintained composure. She sobbed against her sister's shoulder, great heaving sobs that felt like they might tear her apart, crying for everything she had lost and everything she had never really had. And Charlotte simply held her and asked no questions, understanding somehow that explanations could wait until Beatrice was capable of providing them. That night, Beatrice lay in her childhood bedroom, in a bed that felt too small after the luxurious chambers at Sebastian's townhouse and estate, listening to rain continue its assault against the windows. And she thought about Sebastian alone in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his deception, perhaps standing before the fireplace where he had burned her debt papers in what she had thought was an act of generosity, but now understood as just another manipulation, another way of binding her to him through gratitude rather than obligation. She wondered if he was suffering as she was, or if aristocratic privilege had insulated him from genuine pain, if his tears had been real or just another performance designed to elicit her sympathy. And she hated that she could not be certain, that his deception had poisoned even her memories, making her question every moment of tenderness, every shared laugh, every instance of what she had believed was genuine connection. The 1-year anniversary would pass in 3 days, and according to their agreement, they would then separate quietly. And what should have been relief felt instead like a wound that would never fully heal, like losing something essential, even though she had never truly possessed it in the first place. She had won at billiards that night at the Atherton Club, had beaten Sebastian and claimed her victory, but now she understood that she had lost something far more valuable in the process, had traded her heart for the illusion of partnership, and no amount of strategic thinking or geometric calculation could solve this problem, could make the angles work out to anything but loss. 2 weeks of managing her family's small estate with grim determination had not made Beatrice any less miserable, though she convinced herself with decreasing success that this hollow ache was preferable to living a lie, that the clean pain of separation was better than the slow poison of staying with someone who had built their entire relationship on manipulation and control. She threw herself into estate management with almost manic focus, reviewing accounts and negotiating with tenants and planning crop rotations, anything to avoid the moments of stillness when memory would ambush her with images of afternoon light in Ashford Park's billiards room, with the sound of Sebastian's rare, genuine laugh, with the ghost sensation of his hand almost cupping her face in, that carriage before she had pulled away. Charlotte watched her with worried eyes, but asked no questions after that first night of sobbing explanations, simply stayed close and made sure Beatrice ate at least 1 meal per day and slept at least a few hours each night, though the sleep was plagued with dreams that left her more exhausted upon waking than she had been before bed. The rain that had started the night she left London had continued with stubborn persistence, turning the roads to mud and the sky to unrelenting grey, and Beatrice found herself standing at windows watching water stream down glass, thinking with bitter irony that even the weather seemed determined to reflect her internal landscape. She was in her father's old study reviewing quarterly reports when Charlotte burst in without knocking, her face showing a complicated mixture of shock and something that might have been hope or might have been concern. "He is here," Charlotte said breathlessly. "The Duke. He arrived on horseback, alone. And Beatrice, he looks like he has ridden through hell to get here." Beatrice's first instinct was to refuse to see him, to send word that she was not receiving visitors, to maintain the boundaries she had drawn when she left London, but curiosity and something deeper she refused to examine warred with her determination until curiosity won by the narrowest margin. She went to the front door and found Sebastian standing in the rain, soaked through despite his riding coat, his hair plastered to his head, and his face showing exhaustion so profound it bordered on devastation, and he looked nothing like the polished aristocrat who had dismissed her request that first night at the Atherton Club, and everything like a man who had been stripped down to something raw and essential. "I am not here as a duke or a husband," he said before she could speak, his voice hoarse, as though he had been shouting or perhaps weeping. "I am here as a man who loves you and has done everything wrong, and I am asking you to give me one chance to do something right. And you think 1 game of billiards will fix this?" she said, trying to maintain her anger, but finding it harder than expected in the face of his obvious suffering, in the face of how undone he appeared. "No," he replied, "but it is the only language we have both been honest in, the only space where we have ever truly seen each other without masks or performances. So let me be honest now. I love you. I have freed you legally. There is an irrevocable trust established that will pay your family an annuity, regardless of whether you stay married to me or never speak to me again. You have real freedom now, real choice, and I am asking you to play for 1 month of your time. Let me court you as I should have from the beginning. Let me prove that what I feel is genuine, even if how we began was unforgivable. She should have refused, should have sent him away, should have protected herself from further hurt, but something in his eyes, something desperate and genuine that she had never seen there before, made her hesitate, made her wonder whether perhaps they were both broken enough to understand each other's damage. "Where?" she asked, and saw relief flash across his face so intense it looked painful. "Your barn," he said, "where your brother taught you, where this all began before I corrupted it with my manipulation. I have prepared the space, cleaned the table. All I am asking is for you to play 1 game with me. If you win, I will arrange our separation and never contact you again. You will be free of me in every way that matters. If I win, you give me 1 month to court you properly. No obligations, no debts, no games beyond the honest pursuit of your heart." She studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only exhaustion and desperate hope, and after a long moment she nodded once, sharp and decided. "Very well, 1 game. But Sebastian, if this is another manipulation, I swear I will never forgive you." "I know," he said simply. "I am counting on it to keep me honest." She followed him through the rain to the old barn where Edmund had taught her, where she had not been since his death, because it hurt too much to enter this space without him. And when she pushed open the heavy door, she stopped in shock at what Sebastian had done. The dusty, neglected space had been transformed. Candles set up on every available surface, casting warm light that made shadows dance on walls. The billiards table that had gathered dust for 2 years, now cleaned and restored. The felt brushed smooth and the pockets cleared. Chalk and cues laid out with care that suggested this mattered profoundly to him. The rain drummed on the roof with rhythmic insistence, creating an intimate sound that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world, and the scent of old wood and chalk dust mixed with rain brought memories flooding back so intensely she had to steady herself against the doorframe. "You did this," she said, and her voice came out softer than intended, betraying how touched she was by the tenderness evident in every detail, by the fact that he had remembered this place mattered to her and had honored it rather than trying to replace it with something grander. "I did," he confirmed, "because this is where you learned to see impossible possibilities, where your brother taught you that skill matters more than circumstance. And I wanted to meet you here, in the place where you have always been most yourself, where neither of us can hide behind aristocratic performance or social expectation." They took their positions on opposite sides of the table, and Beatrice felt her hands steady in the way they always did when she held a cue, felt herself settling into this element where she had always felt most capable and most free. They lagged for break, and her ball stopped closer, so she took the opening shot, breaking with controlled force that scattered balls across the felt with satisfying cracks. The game progressed in charged silence, each shot calculated and executed with the skill they had both developed, and Beatrice found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of strategy and geometry, the world narrowing to green felt and ivory balls, and the man across from her who watched not the table, but her face, his focus not on winning, but on something else entirely. It was close, brutally close, coming down to final balls with them separated by only a single point, and when Sebastian lined up his last shot, she saw with sudden clarity that he was using a strategy she had taught him, an unconventional bank off 2 cushions that most players would never attempt, seeing an angle that was not obvious but that she would have chosen herself. The ball dropped cleanly into the corner pocket, and the game was his, won by that single point, and she stared at the table, processing not just her loss, but what it meant, what he had just demonstrated. You let me win, she said slowly, not a question but a realization. At the club, that first game, you let me win. He met her eyes directly, no evasion or aristocratic deflection. I did, he said. For about 5 minutes I was the arrogant ass you believed me to be, playing casually and expecting easy victory. Then you made that bank shot off 3 cushions, angles I had never considered, and I stopped caring about winning. I just wanted to see what you would do next. Wanted to watch your mind work. Wanted to understand how you saw possibilities that were invisible to me. Why? She asked, and her voice was shaking now, walls beginning to crack. Because watching you think is the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed, he said, taking a step closer, but not close enough to crowd her, giving her space to retreat if she needed it. Because you see angles no one else sees, in billiards, in life, in me. You saw past the Duke to the man who was terrified of being insufficient, who had been playing by rigid rules his entire life because he was afraid that deviation would reveal how inadequate he actually was. You taught me to take risks, to see unconventional strategies, to believe that impossible shots were merely difficult rather than unachievable. And somewhere in those lessons I fell in love with you so completely that everything else became secondary. I have been just as afraid, she said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff, like free fall with no certainty of landing safely. Afraid to believe anyone could want me for myself, not for what I could provide or manage or fix, not as a curiosity or an amusement, but as someone worth choosing freely. My father chose gambling over his family. My brother died and left me, and I convinced myself that being needed was safer than being wanted because need was quantifiable, but want was terrifyingly subjective. Then let us both be brave, Sebastian said. And now he did move closer, close enough that she could see rain still dripping from his hair, could see the vulnerability in his eyes that matched what she was feeling. Let us choose each other clearly, freely, with full knowledge of our flaws and our fears and our tendency to protect ourselves by building walls that keep out hurt, but also keep out joy. You are asking a lot, she said, but she was already moving toward him, already closing the distance between them with steps that felt simultaneously terrifying and inevitable. I am asking for everything, he replied, because you deserve someone who will, because half measures and careful boundaries and temporary arrangements are not enough. Not for this, not for us. She kissed him first this time, claiming her agency in choosing love rather than simply accepting rescue, rising on her toes to press her lips to his with all the desperate hunger of 2 weeks separation and months of denial, and she felt his stillness for just a moment, as though he was afraid to move and shatter this fragile moment. And then his arms came around her, and he was kissing her back with matching desperation, with relief and joy and something that felt like coming home after being lost for far too long. They were both crying when they finally pulled apart enough to breathe, foreheads pressed together, her hands fisted in his soaked shirt, and his arms around her as though he would never let go. 1 month, she said against his lips, trying to maintain some semblance of control, even as her entire body was betraying how much she wanted to surrender. To court me properly, to prove that this is real. I will need at least 3, he replied, smiling against her mouth in a way she could feel more than see. I intend to be very thorough, intend to court you so properly that you will have no doubt whatsoever about my intentions or my regard. The candlelight made everything soft and forgiving. The rain continued its intimate percussion on the roof, and they stood in the barn where Edmund had first taught Beatrice to see impossible possibilities, where she was now choosing to believe in the most impossible possibility of all, that 2 broken people could find each other and build something whole from their combined damage. 6 months later, they stood in the same barn, now decorated with late spring flowers and filled with the few people who mattered most, and renewed the vows they had originally spoken in a London church before hundreds of aristocratic strangers. But this time the words meant something different. This time they were choosing each other with full knowledge and deliberate intention rather than obligation or convenience. Charlotte cried through the entire ceremony, happy tears this time, and even Sebastian's sister, who had returned from Bath, looked moved by the obvious devotion between them, by the way they could not stop looking at each other as though still amazed by their good fortune. The breakfast afterward was modest by aristocratic standards, but felt more genuine than any grand ball, filled with laughter and stories about billiards lessons gone wrong, and Sebastian's terrible first attempts at unconventional shots, and Beatrice sat beside her husband, because that was what he truly was now, in ways that went beyond legal documentation, and felt something she had not experienced since before Edmund's death, something that might have been peace, or might have been the belief that happiness was possible and even sustainable. 6 years after that, 6 years of genuine partnership and growing understanding, and the kind of love that came from choosing each other daily rather than just once, Beatrice stood in Ashford Park's billiards room on a sunny afternoon and watched Sebastian teach their 5-year-old daughter Arabella how to hold a cue properly. The child stood on a stool to reach the table, all dark curls inherited from her father, and sharp intelligence inherited from them both, and she was explaining in very serious tones that she understood about angles and geometry, even though she could barely reach across the felt. "You are gripping too tightly," Beatrice said, moving to adjust Sebastian's hands on Arabella's smaller ones. "Edmund always said tension ruins accuracy. You need to be firm, but relaxed. I seem to recall you telling me the same thing during our 4th lesson," Sebastian replied with a smile that still made her heart skip even after all these years. "Right before I made that impossible masseur shot that you swore I would never manage. You made it because you finally stopped trying to control everything and trusted your instincts," she said, and pressed a kiss to his temple in the easy, affectionate way of long partnership. "The same lesson applies to parenting, I suspect." "Mama," Arabella said with the impatience of a child who felt adults were straying from important topics. "Are you going to help me make this shot or just kiss Papa all afternoon?" "We can do both," Sebastian said solemnly. "Your mother and I are excellent at managing multiple priorities simultaneously." They positioned themselves around Arabella, Beatrice's hand over their daughters on the cue, Sebastian's hand over both of theirs, and together they guided the shot, the cue ball striking true and sending the target ball rolling across felt to drop into the corner pocket with a satisfying thunk. Arabella squealed with delight, jumping up and down on her stool with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had not yet learned to temper her enthusiasm, and Beatrice caught her before she could fall, swinging her down with a laugh that felt like pure happiness. "That is how it is done," Sebastian said, ruffling his daughter's dark curls. "The best games are played as partners, not opponents, working together toward shared goals rather than competing for individual victory." "Like you and Mama," Arabella said, with the directness of children who see more clearly than adults sometimes wish they would. "You are partners in everything, not just billiards. Exactly like your Mama and me," Sebastian confirmed, meeting Beatrice's eyes over their daughter's head with an expression that conveyed volumes, that spoke of gratitude and love and the ongoing amazement that they had found each other, despite all the obstacles they had created themselves. The afternoon light streamed through tall windows, making dust motes dance in the air, the way it had during those early lessons when they were still strangers negotiating a temporary arrangement. But now this room was filled with laughter and belonging, with the easy intimacy of a family built on honesty and choice, and the daily decision to see each other's worth. That evening, after Arabella was in bed, Beatrice and Sebastian returned to the billiards room for a game of their own, a tradition they had maintained through the years because this space remained somehow sacred, a reminder of where they had learned to truly see each other. They played with comfortable familiarity, no longer needing words to communicate strategy, simply existing together in the rhythm they had built through patience and practice, and the willingness to take impossible shots. "I never thought I could be this happy," Beatrice said during a pause between turns. That night at the Atherton Club, terrified and desperate, I could not have imagined that losing at my own game would lead to winning everything that actually matters. "You did not lose," Sebastian corrected gently, moving close enough to pull her into his arms. "You won. You simply did not realize it until much later, and I am grateful every day that you were brave enough to disguise yourself and infiltrate that club, to beat me at billiards and force me to see what I had been too cowardly to pursue directly." They stood like that for a long moment, swaying slightly in an embrace that needed no music, and through the windows the sun set over Ashford Park's grounds, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson, and Beatrice thought about impossible possibilities, about the woman who had once believed skill was all she had to offer, and the man who had once believed control was the only path to security, and how they had learned together that the best victories were the ones achieved through partnership, through the willingness to be vulnerable, through choosing each other not once but continuously, every day, every impossible shot, every risk taken with steady hands and hearts brave enough to believe that some games change the players in ways that make winning and losing irrelevant compared to the joy of playing together.